Hey everyone, it is Thursday, September 5, 2013. I'm Rene Ritchie, and today we're going to talk all about Apple's upcoming Brightening Your Day iPhone event. This is the iMore Show. Joining me, as always, is the executive editor of The Loop, loopinsight.com, and the managing editor of iMore, and probably the guy who runs 9 or 10 other Apple sites that I'm not aware of, Peter Cohen. How are you, Peter?
They're all porn now, so don't worry about it. I'm fine. How are you, Rene?
I'm doing very well, thank you, but I will never get that mental image out of my head now. Also joining us is the senior editor of 9to5Mac, one of the classiest and smartest bloggers that I have the good fortune of knowing, Mr. Mark Gurman. How are you, Mark?
Great. How are you? Thank you for having me. And I feel the same about you and Peter, for what it's worth. So.
Well, no, thank you for being on. I mean, we want to talk about the Apple event, and I figured there's no one better in the world to talk about this stuff with than you, because it's the exciting part of the year, but it's also increasingly something that we know more and more about before the event starts. So I guess maybe before we start that, Mark, are we just living in the year of spoilers? Is it a bad thing? I mean, if you go to Ain't It Cool News and you read what's going to be in the next Avengers movie, that's a spoiler, but you can go to a blog and read about what's going to be on the next Apple event. So I'm not sure it's any different.
Yeah, I think this was a big year in terms of leaks, especially in terms of tangible leaks such as parts, hard evidence. I remember 2012, the iPhone 5 I actually feel was more leaked than the iPhone 5S, let's say, probably on levels of the iPhone 5C.
The 4 was left in a bar.
Right, but that's different though. That's something that, it's not out of the supply chain. It's not out of Cupertino. That was, you can consider that a freak accident. So other than that, I think the iPhone 4 was actually pretty good in terms of, not being leaked. The iPhone 4S, everyone thought it was an iPhone 5 until August, just a few months before the event. iPhone 5 last year, I mean, that was very clear. We had a very clear picture of that device all the way in the first quarter of 2012. This year, I mean, there's a lot of information, a lot of parts floating around, but I still don't think we have 100% of the story. I think there's implications with iOS 7. There's the story beyond the launch. There's a story about how people are going to feel about it. What is Apple going to add to it? How is Apple going to change it in the coming months? Just like iPhone OS 1.0 was a really big deal back in 2007, Apple spent the next 5 years building upon that. And now with iOS 7, they're starting again. So I think the story is going to turn to, what's iPhone OS 2 on top of iOS 7, and et cetera, et cetera. How are they going to build on top of that? So I think it's really a never-ending cycle, even with the leaks. So I also just don't think it's unprecedented. Like, we saw that every year it was getting worse and worse.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I have this ongoing discussion with Georgia where she almost only will watch a movie one time because to her, knowing what happens is part of her enjoyment. And I'll watch, movies and TV shows over and over again because I enjoy watching the actors, apply their craft, even if I already know the story. Almost like, Game of Thrones spoilers, the red something or other. That happened in the books 13 years ago. Is that really a spoiler? Peter, I mean, even Apple got in on the action. They showed the Mac Pro off at WWDC.
Yeah, and it isn't the first time that they've introduced a product before it's been available. I mean, the iPad comes to mind immediately. But, it definitely seems like Apple is not enforcing as much secrecy in its supply line as it used to. And whether that's because, of the change of management or what, I'm not exactly sure.
But the massive scale.
Yeah, and the massive scale obviously has something to do with it as well. But it's pretty clear that people no longer live in fear of being steved like they used to. And as a result, we are seeing more, leaks of products ahead of time. But I completely agree with what Mark just said. Even though we might see a case or a box or individual components here and there, it's like the parable about the three blind men and the elephant. One feels the trunk and says it's a snake. One feels the ear and says it's a palm tree. One feels the tail and says it's a rope. We're getting bits and pieces of the story here, but we're not getting the gestalt of what the iPhone 5S or what the iPhone 5C are going to be, and we won't until next week. So there's still plenty of surprises. Having said that, I also have no doubt that pundits and analysts will do their best to be underwhelmed by whatever Apple presents, because otherwise there's no story.
Boring and unimaginative. All of that by way of prefacing that this is our annual iPhone event preview show. So if you want to, get our thoughts on Steve Ballmer, you can listen to Vector. Did a whole show with Ben Thompson on that. If you want to listen to something else, we have all a bunch of different stuff. But this show, we're going to talk about the iPhone. We're going to return to actually talking about Apple stuff. First, let's talk about the design. Mark, Apple has done for a while now these S models, iPhone 3GS, iPhone 4S. Now it sounds like we're going to be getting an iPhone 5S, and that means they keep the same casing and general design around, maybe with a few tweaks. But the general concern is that in a world where you have Galaxy S4s and HTC Ones and Nokia 1020s, it's going to be harder and harder for Apple to do this. You think that's still a viable strategy for them?
To keep the S strategy, keeping last year's hardware. I mean, on the one hand, if you look at the competition and let's say they're changing up their design, no, it's not a viable strategy. But if you look at the other side of the coin, what does allowing them to keep the design mean for the consumer? See, this is the way I look at it. The iPhone 5, it had like an all-new design externally, but it didn't really add any additional functionality over the iPhone 4S before it. The iPhone 4S, Apple had the resources by keeping the iPhone 4 design to add inventions like Siri. And you're looking at the iPhone 5S, there's going to be some unique features to that as well, such as a fingerprint scanner. But with the iPhone 5, which is the all-new design, there was really nothing marquee about it. So, you really have to look at both sides of the coin. And, additionally, them not, putting out a new design this year after the iPhone 5 redesign, what does that mean for the 2014 iPhone? Would it be an even bigger design change? Because of course already talked of a bigger screen, et cetera, et cetera. So you have to weigh the pros and the cons of that. And I think as Tim Cook and Steve Jobs and Apple executives have always said, it's up to Apple to make the decisions for the consumers.
So, I mean, Peter, Apple last year rebuilt the phone by the atom. It was a machining process that verged on porn. There's that word again. And people didn't care. A lot of people just said, oh, it's boring, it's unimaginative, it's still a rounded rectangle. This year, there are rumors that there will be a light gold or champagne version. We've also seen some casings that were steel-like gray. Is that Apple saying, fine, you didn't care that we spent all this time and money to make a completely new design? We'll give you some different colors. Enjoy those.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly can be argued that Apple is doing that for that reason. I also think that it's going to help differentiate in the customer's mind and other customers' mind whether or not it's an iPhone 5 or an iPhone 5S. There's a novelty to be said or to be had in having something that looks different. And look, if you're going to drop $650 for a new phone, or if you're going to go on contract and pay for a phone over 2 years, you want to make sure that other people, know that you've got the latest and greatest model. And having a graphite or champagne-colored iPhone is a good way of doing that, short of, having your iPhone custom anodized like some people, Rene.
Well, I remember when the iPhone 4S came out, the people were actually making stickers saying, yes, I have the new one, because they cared so badly about people's perception. What's your take on the colors, Mark? I mean, it sounds like up to 4 colors for the iPhone 5S and a slew of previously, iPod-specific colors for the 5C.
Sure. I agree with Peter's point entirely that Apple could be using the new color sets for the 5S to be a differentiating factor in the market, trying to appease certain customers, like you said, Rene, people wanting other people to know that they have the new Apple iPhone. But additionally, I think it's very much attached to the 5C. I think the different colored 5Cs is something in the pipeline for a very long time. And perhaps Apple figured, hey, what if people who want the more high-end, the more elegant iPhone 5S, they want to get in the color action as well. So it makes sense to me that, just looking at your background there, Rene, like if they're popping out all those colors for the 5C, they might want to throw something in for the 5S as well. And, the 5C is rumored to have some pink, some red, some dark blues, light blues, yellow perhaps, et cetera, et cetera. You look at graphite or champagne gold, I guess those are higher end colors if you want to look at the color wheel in that way. So yeah, I think it makes sense in both in Peter's opinion, the way he explained it, and the way, my theory as well.
Yeah, and it sounds like because metallic is usually associated with premium, you'll have gold and silver and steel and slate, and the colors. Apple has usually used the colors for the lower end stuff. The high-end iPhones or iPods would be white and black, and the low-end ones, and now the iPod Touch is in that category thanks to the iPad Mini, got all these colors. And what's interesting to me is that there's been talk that there won't be a black iPhone 5C. Now we've heard that the gold was the most popular anodization color by far. It was a majority of the requests for aftermarket anodization, so it sounds really popular and makes sense. But black is traditionally the highest selling color of anything, whether it's a phone or a case. And by keeping that, like I remember Apple didn't have a black cheap version of the iPad smart cover. If you wanted black, you had to go up to the leather version. I wonder if they keep black. I don't know if this makes sense to you, Mark, but they keep black as sort of the premium color, so people who really want it don't opt for the cheap version instead.
Well, I mean, in terms of the 5C, the most recent leaks in recent months differentiate from like the earlier iPhone 5C leaks in that all the colors, like you have a red one, a yellow one, blue one, they all seem to have a black front face. Mm-hmm. So, I guess if those newer leaks are true, the iPhone 5C will have some, black, like the front will be black and the back would be different colors. So I guess in that regard, people on the lower end will get that color. But, I don't know if they're restricting black to the 5S just to make it a higher end color. I don't particularly think it is a high end color because, the iPhone, from, remembering my history correctly, the iPhone 3G became like an 8 gigabyte and a 16 gigabyte. And the 8 gigabyte was in black only, and to get the white one, you had to get the 16 gigabyte. So I think in Apple's opinion, perhaps white is the higher end color.
Well, that's my second question, because there have been some people who've suggested that gold would be restricted to a theoretical 128 gigabyte or whatever the highest end version of the iPhone is. And there is that history you mentioned. Some people have also said it'll be restricted to China, but Apple's never done regional color exclusives. But they have done price point or storage capacity exclusives. Do you think there's any possibility that they would keep the gold and maybe the steel color to the 64 128 gigabyte model?
I think that's very, very certainly plausible. I don't know if it will happen, but it makes sense. It makes sense to me given the past history. But I agree with you 100%. There's no way they would regionally make a color or a feature exclusive. That doesn't really make any sense. It wouldn't be in Apple's best interest. It wouldn't be in anyone's best interest.
I know Peter would be heartbroken if his 128 gigabyte iPhone had to come in gold.
Yes, indeed. I want it in graphite, not gold.
So were you thinking the 128 gigabyte would only come in gold? Or
no, I'm just bugging Peter because he's been hating on the gold iPhone for weeks.
It's true. Yeah. It's true. It's certainly plausible, Rene, that they would do like certain machines in limited color schemes, because if you take a look at what Apple's done in the past, to differentiate last year's model, for example, they'll keep last year's model in production, but they'll only do it in one color, and then the new ones will be the ones that'll be available in black or white. I guess we'll see. We'll find out in a few days.
So that's my other question. I'm going to wait until because Mark almost always gets this information early, so I'm going to wait till I can link to him on this. But just spitballing here, the price-wise, if Apple introduces 128 gigabyte, if they go for the double density or the higher density NAND flash, does that slide in on top as another SKU like it did with the 128 gigabyte iPad and the way it did, I think, with the iPhone 4S? Or does it replace an existing SKU the way it did, I think, with the iPhone 3GS when they got the 32 gigabyte model? So will you be able to get 16, 32, 64, and 128? Or just 128, 64, 32, and 16 becomes exclusive to the middle tier black iPhone 5 remnant?
I mean, if you just look at the history, there's 3 different historical points. There's the iPad. They added 120 gigabyte on top, and they retained, the 16, 32, and 64. Mm-hmm. For the 4S, they did something different. They added the 64 gigabyte on top and only kept 2 tiers below it, the 16 and 32. And so there was probably one more thing I was going to say.
3GS when they went
3GS,
to 8. Yeah.
Right. So they doubled the capacities with the 3GS, but they kept the price points. So there's 3 different situations in which Apple has increased capacities, and they've done a different strategy in each situation. So I guess we know our three options, and we'll just have to see which one Apple picks. My best guess, I think they would double the capacities and keep the 64 gigabyte price point. So it would be $199, $299, $399, all capacities doubled. So that would be the best of both worlds for everything Apple's done. That would be retaining the higher price point of the higher capacity, but they would be doubling capacities across the board.
So I like Mark's world better because my guess, and it's a complete guess, is that just like the color gold could be a premium feature, 128 is something a lot of people have been wanting, and Apple might feel, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Peter, but people like you who like iPod Classics, Apple might feel they could soak you for an extra $100.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, people are going to have to pay for the storage capacity. NAND flash memory does not come for free. But the fact of the matter is that a lot of regular mom-and-pop consumers who own iPhones are running into space limitations. You know, they get a 16 gigabyte phone, and within a few months, they've loaded up a bunch of applications, they've loaded up a whole bunch of photos, maybe a movie or two, or music, and they hit that 16 gigabyte ceiling, and a lot of them don't know what to do. So in a perfect world, I would love to see Apple drop the 16 to last year's model, you know, to an iPhone 5 if they're going to continue with an iPhone 5 in the pipeline, you know, for the prepaid market and, you know, people who are looking for a $99 phone. And then, you know, for the iPhone 5S, it'd be 32, 64, 128. I would love to see that happen.
I would too. You know, I had an iPad 2, and my original iPad 2 was stolen, so I got an iPad 2 just before the iPad 3 launched because I needed it for iMore, and I got a 16 gigabyte because I didn't want to waste a lot of money. And then I went to test a game on it recently, and it was still on iOS 6 point something. It wanted to upgrade. I couldn't even upgrade because there was no memory left. And I think, Mark, we have this feeling now that online storage is, you know, an answer to having less local capacity. But, you know, iCloud is still incredibly stingy with the amount of space they give you, and everything else is really more nearline, and you've got to spend your time downloading, uploading. It becomes like a managerial nightmare.
Well, the way I think of the current, you know, slew of online cloud services that exist in terms of my own usage, and maybe Rene or Peter can relate to this, it's just a synchronization tool, in my opinion. It doesn't really store anything in the cloud. It's all on my local drives, my local phone, anyways. So, you know, it looks like, you know, it's just a synchronization service that Apple's charging for, making me pay so much for. You know, you know, it doesn't really solve anything except the synchronization issues. It doesn't alleviate the need for onboard storage. That's why you have a 128 gigabyte iPad, and that's why we'll probably have a 128 gigabyte iPhone. If cloud really did anything in that regard, these phones would come with 16 gigabytes. And I guess in the Apple TV, it currently makes sense because it's connected to the cloud consistently, but it doesn't make sense on these current devices.
Having said that, I have to recognize that 128, even on the iPad, is an edge case. It's not something that all retailers keep in stock. It's not something that it seems like customers are going out in droves to get because, I mean, it's an $800 iPad at that point. And I mean, you're you know, $200 away from just getting a MacBook Air. With actually the same amount of storage capacity. So unless Apple's able to change the economics of NAND flash on their end, I'm not sure that a lot of customers would be willing to pay for the extra storage, but I certainly see a case where power users like the three of us might say, yeah, you know, it's worth it to me to spend a little bit more to get a lot more storage than what I can get otherwise.
Go big or go Android.
Yeah, and by the same token, like, on the iPad, perhaps 120 gigabytes is much different than 128 gigabyte use cases on an iPhone. The way Apple was promoting the 120 gigabyte iPad earlier this year when it launched was for businesses that need to store lots of local files, big artwork files, drawing, etc., etc. But on an iPhone, it could be more about music because I guess, at least in my case, I'll have my headphones hooked up to my iPhone listening to music, and I'll never do that with my iPad. So, and you know, music takes up a lot of storage. So.
And you'll probably take video with your iPhone when you won't be outside taking lots of video with your iPad.
Exactly. So 120 gigabytes might have, well, yeah, 120 gigabytes, in my opinion, is much more beneficial to the, you know, wide marketplace than 120 gigabyte iPad.
And something else
iPhone.
you said that I agree with is the Apple TV can get away. I think it has 8 gigabytes of local storage. It can get
Yeah.
away with that because it actually allows you to stream from iTunes, which Apple can't do yet on iOS devices. But if I didn't have to download movies onto my iPhone or iPad before watching them, and I could just stream them, I wouldn't need anywhere near the capacity. And I agree with you too about iCloud. For me, it basically does device restore. If I need to, it can back up and restore, and it doesn't really help me with nearline at all.
Yeah.
Let's move on to the processor, because I know Mark's had some interesting stuff about the Apple A7. Last year, Apple introduced the A6, which was their first custom silicon. It was the Swift processor. It still used a Power VR graphics chip. It wasn't a custom graphics chip yet. Had a really good image signal processor. The only thing I've heard so far is that it's going to be more advanced than last year. It's not necessarily much faster, but more power efficient. And I'm wondering if it's going to be more like Haswell, Mark, where the benefits, we've gotten phones that are fast enough, so now Apple wants to make sure the battery life is really, really good, and maybe the GPU goes to a Rogue, PowerVR Rogue, so that it can even better push around all the stuff that iOS 7 is offering.
Right. So, you've heard more efficient, more advanced, and whatnot. And Clayton Morris, he chimed in with the 31% faster statistic, and I guess that lines up perfectly with what you just described. And I guess perhaps that 31% could make up for perhaps the new transitions, animations, transparencies, and blurs in iOS 7. Perhaps this was the game plan all along. What I've heard specifically is that they have been testing A7s that are based on 64-bit architecture for future iPhones, and they've been testing them in iPhone 5S, iPhone 5 bodies. So it's definitely been in the works. I don't know if it will launch in this new phone, but it's definitely been something they have been considering. The benefits, more, better animations, improved transparencies, better gaming, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, there's been a lot of, responses to that saying, why does Apple need 64-bit processors in an iPhone that only has 1 or 1.5 gigabytes of RAM? So, we'll have to see in that regard. But nonetheless, the processor is going to need to match the software, so the user experience is solid like every iPhone to date. Not the iPad 3, though, because that was just terrible.
That was horrible. Well, they replaced that really quickly.
Yeah.
Peter, I mean, you went through the transition on OS 10 when they went from 32-bit to 64-bit. They managed it really well, but the big advantage there is it let them address far more RAM. So they could take bigger bytes, not do things faster, but do more stuff at the same amount of time. Do you see any way that translates into an advantage on the iPhone?
Limited for now. I mean, once Apple switches over to a 64-bit architecture, I'm assuming that they're still going to have to do a fair amount of work in the operating system to take advantage of that. I don't know that iOS 7 is completely optimized for 64-bit. And, of course, developers are going to have to hop on board as well. But it is what it is. If Apple is future-proofing the design of the chip now for future work, then so be it.
Well, that's interesting, too, because the iPhone 5 had 1 gigabyte of RAM, and Apple, at least to my mind, Mark, has always been incredibly stingy with RAM. They put enough RAM in for it to work, but when they would introduce another OS or a new OS 2 years later, that RAM became a real limitation. So I don't know if they'll stick with we can get by on 1 gig, or if they'll go to 1.5 or 2 gigs for this one.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised to see them. Well, I wouldn't be surprised either way. I wouldn't be surprised to see them, keep it at the 1 gigabyte, and I wouldn't be surprised to see them go to 1.5 or 2 gigabytes. And I agree that the RAM, they weren't very forward-thinking with their RAM allotments in earlier iOS devices. But then again, they need to sell more devices. So.
All right, so a lot of people, Peter, have been saying this over and over again. They want something faster than USB 2, and right now, Apple went to the Lightning connector, but their architecture inside iOS devices, the NAND flash they don't use NAND flash. I don't know if they can, but right now the NAND flash is saturated just over USB 2, so there's not really any point to USB 3, and there's no PCIe architecture, so there's no point to having Lightning on one end and Thunderbolt on the other end. That's not going to change this year, but is that something that you look forward to? You think they could eventually go there?
Yeah, or perhaps getting the future iPhone up to 802.11 AC might be another way to go, because we all like to keep it wireless when we can. And let's face it, if there's no penalty in using a wireless connection to do everything that we need it to do, why would we ever hook it up to to a computer to begin with. A lot of people don't. I mean, a lot of people who own iPhone 5s, iPhone 4s, and iPhone 4Ss have literally never attached the device to their computer. They
I
do
haven't since
everything over
iCloud
the air.
launched.
I haven't
Not once,
either.
yeah.
You know, so I mean, you know, the point of the cable, I think, is more for charging than it is for anything else these days. If Apple can keep pace with that by adopting wireless technology, then great.
Yeah, we saw a MacBook Air that was 802.11 AC, Mark, and we saw time capsules and Airport Extremes that were 802.11 AC. So it could make sense for the next iPhone to go there.
Yeah, I wouldn't doubt it. I don't know what the chip size is, if they can actually fit physically an AC chip in the phone. I don't know the technical side of that. But, you know, just as a consumer, someone just watching the current industry, it makes sense in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple Android phones that are 802. I mean, Phil Nicholson had one, I think, 3 months ago that was 802.11 AC, so the technology is out there. Apple's usually conservative with their radio. I mean, not on the Mac, but on iOS, they've been conservative with their radios. They only went to 802.11n on 5 gigahertz fairly recently, so
Right.
I don't know, but I would really like that. Switching to radios, because Peter brought it up, Bluetooth is already maxed out. They're already at Bluetooth 4.0 with low energy and high speed. That can't go any further. They're probably not going to do NFC. I mean, there doesn't seem to be any point to them doing
There's
NFC.
no need. I mean, you can see, like, the perfect example is that new iOS 7 Apple TV feature, where you can tap your iOS device on the Apple TV to initiate the setup process. I mean, they're doing that without NFC, so I guess the possibilities are really limitless with the current technology. So.
Well, that's what surprised me, is that a lot of people put NFC chips in, I think, just because it was a new chipset and then tried to find features to go with it, where Apple introduces a new feature set and then figures out the technology that they need, and they're radically different approaches.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It says a lot about the companies. Yeah.
Yeah, one is putting the cart before the horse, and I'll leave it to our viewers to figure out which one is which.
Well, I mean, we were discussing this in our chat room earlier today because Simon Sage paid for something at a supermarket using NFC on his BlackBerry Q10, but it's not a widespread. I mean, that's just not a popular technology yet, and you could probably do all sorts of payments. I mean, when they introduced Passbook was I forget what it's called. Passbook Kit was widely abstracted, so that Apple could slot in all sorts of things from barcode scanning eventually to Bluetooth low energy transactions. So it seems like they're forward thinking, but they don't particularly care what chip does it at the end of the day.
Yeah.
We lost Peter.
Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. PayPass is what comes to mind immediately. I see PayPass kiosks all the time at my local pharmacy and elsewhere. But it's funny because I've had a few discussions with the cashiers at these places, and I'm like, does anybody use this stuff? Oh no, I've never seen anybody swipe their phone or anything else, you know, over the PayPass thing. They're always just, you know, running their debit cards. So I think that you know, MasterCard and a couple of other companies have made a strong play to try to get NFC distributed into retail establishments in certain places in the United States, but despite that, there hasn't been a big consumer upswell for it. It's a solution. It's the classic solution in search of a problem.
Now, I have a chip on both my debit card and my cash card, and I can pay. A lot of Canadian stores and gas stations and restaurants will let you just hit the chip to pay for anything up to, I think, $50 or $60. So I almost never have to swipe or even type in a code anymore for small transactions. And that, in some ways, frightens me, because if I ever just drop my card on the ground, people are going to get a lot of free gas off of me before anything happens to stop it, which kind of brings me to the fingerprint scanner. And, you know, I didn't hear very much about it at all until very recently, but Mark's been, you know, much more on top of it than I am. But the idea of having that kind of technology in a phone, unless it can prove your identity, to me is more of a scary proposition.
Yeah, you know, it's probably really much a gimmick, kind of like Siri was. You know, I can't tell you, hey, that's 100% going to be on the iPhone 5S that's introduced next week, but I can tell you they've been prototyping it for the iPhone 5S and future phones, and it's in the home button. The home button looks mostly the same. It's not like a big convex, you know, lump.
It's not a Sapphire Audi.
Right. I mean, it might be Sapphire, but it looks mostly the same. Like, my mom and dad are not going to know the difference, you know. But, you know, it could be a problem. I don't know how well the technology works. There's been articles about how the fingerprint technology is not perfected. So I think it will be a few years perhaps until it's solid, just like Siri is becoming solid over the last few years. At the same time, I've been hearing from people at Apple that they're thinking of the fingerprint scanner as sort of like a hardware beta test. Perhaps not beta hardware, but thinking of it as that, because it's probably just going to start off as a way to unlock the phone. Maybe next year they'll integrate it with iCloud Keychain. Maybe the year after they'll integrate it with payments. So I think it's going to be a long process of software-based innovation on top of the sensor. It's kind of like they're laying the groundwork for future technologies.
Yeah, I heard very similar to you. I heard originally that they were, once they bought Authentic, I think a lot of people started assuming that they would be working on this technology. I didn't hear anything about it till recently, and then I heard they were doing mass testing of it because it's not an insignificant problem. You want enough points to identify the person, but too many, you start getting a lot of false positives. And if people can't access their phone, they're going to just stop using it. They're going to turn it off, and then there's very little point of having the technology.
Right.
So they have to only do it enough that it's pretty sure it's you, and you'll have the choice about using a passcode or using the thumb scanner. And exactly that, they'll only do it for passcode in the beginning, but then those other technologies slowly over time, up to and including transactions, will be factored in. I think that's the smart approach, and I keep going back to this conversation that I had with Ford at CES, where they said, we can make cars do amazing things, but they scare the crap out of people when you take control away from them, and most people are scared by technology, and you have to do very, very slowly. And I think Apple has a patience to them that allows them to put a fingerprint scanner in and only let it do one thing, where a lot of companies, and I don't know if you correct me if I'm wrong here, Peter, would put that in and look at it as an excuse to do everything in the kitchen sink immediately.
Yeah, absolutely. And Apple will speed that process up if it can and if it wants to, if it looks like it's a good match with consumers. I could see it coming out with one ability, and then if it's widely adopted and widely liked and so on, unlocking new features incrementally with software updates. That's certainly an approach that Apple has taken in the past that works well. So I completely agree.
And I am predicting a Christmas commercial where Mr. Scrooge tries to get into Santa's iPhone to get the Christmas list, and he just can't authenticate, and then Santa grabs it, authenticates, and all the kids get their presents. Holiday ads.
It's interesting. The Wall Street Journal just put out an alert. They're saying that Apple's testing 6-inch iPhones.
Well, you know this as well as I do, Mark. But Apple has almost everything, up to and including an iEspresso maker in the labs, and they are very proud of the things that they say no to. They've had a 5-inch iPhone testing for years, not a year, but for a couple of years. So I'm not surprised that they have phablets, and they probably have a 13-inch iPad in testing. That's why we get all these crazy rumors all the time, because and it's what Tim Cook said, and you quote so often, where you get one data point, and then people make a lot of assumptions off that one data point.
Right.
All right, so sorry, I lost you for a second, Mark.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay.
Rounding out the radio stuff, LTE, it came with the iPhone 5. LTE, you still can't do voice over LTE, which isn't a big problem on GSM carriers because you drop down to DCHPA plus, which is still 42 megabits per second, and no human can tell the difference. But on Verizon and Sprint, you drop down to EVDO Rev A, which is 2 megabits per second if you're lucky, and that's a huge problem because EVDO Rev A doesn't do voice over data either, so it'll just kill your connection. Voice over LTE will probably fix this, but it's not widespread enough. I don't think any of the U.S. carriers are really rolling it out yet. And there's also LTE Advanced, which will, we did a wonderful vector show with Sasha Sagan where he explained all this stuff to me like I was a 3-year-old, and I really appreciated it. But LTE is so complicated. There's 40 different segments of bands to support. There's different in some areas of America they've got 3-lane LTE highways, and in Toronto they've got a 20-lane LTE highway, so you can get much different speeds even on LTE. I haven't heard anything about the LTE chipset in the iPhone 5S, Mark, except that they might be able to support more bands on fewer SKUs. But I haven't heard anything about LTE Advanced. I haven't heard anything about TD-LTE for China, although it's certainly possible given the negotiations. and voice over LTE sounds like it's years away still. So I'm not sure how much new radio stuff we'll get.
I mean, here's my take in terms of voice over LTE first. Like FaceTime audio, perhaps eventually that will become a more mainstream type of thing, just as iMessage over the last few years has become the de facto way of text messaging from an iPhone, just by way of so many people having iOS devices these days. In terms of shrinking down the amount of SKUs for the new iPhones, I think that makes total sense. Look at it now. They have a Verizon model and a GSM model and this upcoming China Mobile, TD, whatever you call it, LTE model. That's 3 SKUs. And then you look at the iPhone 5C, it's going to be, 5, 6 colors times 3 SKUs times capacities? It's going to be insane. So I think what you're hearing about the fewer SKUs, more bands per device is probably on the money simply because they have to, just in terms of manufacturing and shipping purposes.
I haven't thought that much about the storage capacities for an iPhone 5C. Like, I probably wouldn't get 128 gigabytes,
Right.
but I wonder if it'll have 3 storage sizes, 2 storage sizes. That'll be interesting to see too.
Yeah, I'm thinking 1 or 2. Definitely not 3.
Yeah, it's going to be a less expensive iPhone for a reason. Although the iPad Mini had every SKU that the iPad, until 128 gigabyte, it had every model that the full price iPad had.
Yeah.
Apple, so hard to predict. Peter, do you have any thoughts on radios in the iPhone 5S? Do they have to push those much further?
I think they do. I think that Apple's got to keep pace with what the competition is doing, especially. And the fact of the matter is that the cell carriers are investing a lot of money and a lot of effort in expanding their infrastructure. And in any case where Apple isn't up to date with what's going on, then they run the risk of falling behind or not measuring up well when it comes to competition. It's interesting. The case of voice over LTE, for example, a lot of people knock the iPhone's inability to make calls and work on data at the same time when it's working over a CDMA network, like Verizon's. These are surmountable problems if Apple engineered the iPhone differently, but they don't, because they don't want to make compromises to their design to suit the carrier. Apple's got to give a little bit, but it's always a trade-off in terms of, what is Apple giving up by adding new capabilities? Are they sacrificing battery life? Are they increasing size? Are they increasing heat and so on? It's a careful balancing
It's black
act.
magic.
It really is. I wouldn't want to be in the position of those engineers having to make those decisions.
I mean, I don't know if it was last year or the year before, they added wideband audio, which is supported by very few carriers and created all sorts of confusion. And LTE Advanced could create just the same kind of confusion. Maybe Germany will benefit from it. We'll see. Moving over to the cameras, the iPhone 4S, I think, was when Apple really had their coming out party for the camera. It went to 8 megapixels. Maybe the iPhone 4 when Steve Jobs came out and he gave his famous "It's about the photons" speech, catching photons. We're going to bigger microns to catch more photons. I think that really showed that Apple was taking the camera seriously, and then Phil Schiller picked that up, and they went to the 8 megapixel sensor and the backlight illumination and the ISP, the image signal processor in the Apple chipsets. And a lot of people don't like when I say this, but the image signal processor for Apple turned out to be more important than the optics for a lot of competing cameras. On paper, the HTC One, the Nokia Lumia 920 had much better optics, much better sensors, but Apple's image signal processor meant that for everyday photography, for just people wanting to capture moments, they often got as good a result as cameras that were much newer and had much better lenses on them. So last year, Apple's big innovation was they made the iPhone 5 so thin that it took a miracle of engineering to keep the same camera quality as the iPhone 4S, because cameras like depth. They hate being in thin enclosures. So they got all 5 pieces of glass in there. They got them better aligned so they were even sharper. They had, the IR filter was there. They put a sapphire lens on it. What do they do for an Encore? There's very little that's obvious. I mean, optical image stabilization, but it's hard to see them putting that in the existing case.
Right. So I would say that the megapixels is probably going to be the same
Yeah.
from the iPhone 5. You know, over the last few months, Apple has been specifically saying megapixels don't matter. Megapixels don't matter. Like on their website and emails to consumers about their 9 JD Power Awards. Like, who cares? So yeah, I think it's going to stick to 8 megapixels. There's talk of a bigger aperture, bigger
Yeah,
focal
2.0.
point, 2.0, or is that bigger or smaller? I don't know.
This is where I miss Leanna because it's smaller, but apparently it's bigger.
Okay. So it's like scoring a golf game.
I guess it's not bowling. It's not bowling. It's something else.
Right. So I think they're going to stay there in that regard. Sapphire. I mean, like you said, there's nothing really obvious besides software. The Galaxy S4 had a lot of software enhancements for the camera, and I found some code in the iOS 7 betas, or someone found it and I wrote about it, about a slow motion mode.
Mm-hmm.
The Galaxy S4 has that, and it could be, it could have artistic implications. I've watched some videos on YouTube, demos of the slow motion mode, which is 120 frames per second, and it looks really cool. You can do some really neat stuff with it, just as, the panorama mode, you can do some really cool art with that too on the iPhone 5 and 4S. So, we'll have to see. Of course, there's the talk of there's a dual LED.
Yeah.
There's tons of parts, and I've heard that specifically on the back of the phone to, better low light photos and better low light video. The microphone is, instead of being an oval, it's more of a circle now. I don't know what that means, but perhaps better noise pickup or improved reducing noise.
Well, yeah, because we don't just use it as a phone anymore. We use it for FaceTime. We use it for Siri. So the microphones have got to not be the same as a phone microphone anymore.
Precisely. So I think we'll see minor hardware tweaks, but I think the software story will be the bigger picture this year. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, Peter, we saw the HTC One drop down to 4 megapixels so they could oversample and do their optical image stabilization. And the 120 frames per second video sounds great, not only for slow motion, but if they're oversampling the frames, they could maybe theoretically get even smoother normal video. But you're a photographer too. Is there anything that you need? Should they try again to go to higher, like 2 microns, the way that HTC did?
I have to confess something. I got my hands on a Lumia 1020 for the first time last week. This is Lumia. This is the Lumia with the 41 megapixel
it's not a face hugger of a phone, like onto the phone.
Yeah. I mean, it adds some bulk, and it changes the geometry of the phone, and it also changes the center of gravity in a really weird way. But it is an amazing, amazing camera on a phone. The level of detail that I could see in the photos that this phone had taken were absolutely astonishing to me compared to what I can do with my iPhone 5. So I've got a little bit of envy when it comes to those Lumia users who have that particular model. I think that Apple has to, at some point or another, increase the pixel density on the sensor, get a higher megapixel rating on there. They should also try to improve the iPhone 5's ability in low light. It's kind of slacking there. For everything else, it comes back to what we were talking about with radio chips a few moments ago. There are engineering compromises that Apple has to make, and go too far in one direction, and you're going to sacrifice the usability of the phone. Go too far in the other direction, and you run the risk of being irrelevant to the people who are using it. The fact of the matter is, people take a lot of pictures on their phones. So this is a more important feature set than I think a lot of people really give it credit for, and it serves Apple well to remain as competitive as they can within the constraints of how they can engineer it.
I don't know if I ever asked you this, Mark, but we've talked about this before. In an alternate universe where Apple did not consider thinness to be such an important feature, and the iPhone 5 came out just as thin as the iPhone 4S, but they used that extra space to have double the battery life, maybe, or at least 1.5 times the battery size, and a camera that used that extra Z-index to be a much better camera. That would be an interesting Apple product. I don't know if we'd ever see that. I don't know if an iPhone 6 with a bigger screen will get those benefits, but I would be interested in that product.
I would as well. I think battery life, even at WWDC, Apple said, what's the most important feature that you want on a mobile product? Battery life. Hence the new MacBook Air. It's all about the chips. The speeds of the processor are slower, but you get better battery life. So it's really weighing pros and cons. Perhaps in the MacBook Air, they increased the speed of the flash memory, and that really made up for some lag that could have happened from the slower clock speed on the processor. But with the iPhone, I guess Apple feels that they are making the right trade-offs as of now, that thinness is more important than battery life. I think they perhaps currently feel or have felt that their battery life statistics are good enough, of a ratio to the thinness of the device, the weight, other factors. Just like they were talking about Tim Cook about bigger screen sizes. There's so many pros and cons, and Apple had to make a decision of keeping the right combination of pros and the right combination of cons. And to Apple, the iPhone 5's 4-inch screen, many people consider it a con, and perhaps Apple considers it a huge con as well compared to these 5-6-inch phones. But they feel the pros of the resolution, the clarity, how long the screen lasts outweigh that.
It seems, getting into that for a second, that's actually something I forgot to talk about earlier, is Apple seems to be on, they went to Retina with the iPhone 4, they went to 4 inches with the iPhone 5, so it seems like they've got their TikTok schedule now for displays as well, and maybe on the iPhone 6 we'll get a new display. I don't know if we'll get anything new this year. I don't think so. Like some people will have this big wish list, like ISGO, whatever it is, panels, because Apple went to in-cell last time. This is even a step further, where it's thinner, clearer technology again, or self-refreshing displays where there's enough smarts in the display to hold an image and the GPU doesn't have to run and keep updating it. I don't think we'll see any of this year, but I do think Apple might have more plans for the display next year.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I agree with that on the iPhone side. But if you want to jump to iPad for a second, I mean, they're going to have to do something with display technology if they're going to get a Retina display in that.
Yes.
It's going to, iGZO, or whatever you call it for that. But back to the iPhone, I think that, yeah, very doubtful. I remember there were rumors earlier this year how they were going to keep the same screen size but double the resolution again. That doesn't really make much sense.
That's insane.
Yeah.
At 4x is insane. Mark, it wasn't Mark. I don't know if it was Mark Edwards who said at 3x might be more rational and doesn't have very many drawbacks. But even then, if you pump it up, I did the math earlier this year, and if you pump up the iPhone to the iPad display size, you get 5 inches at the current resolution, which it doesn't hit the Retina threshold of 300 pixels per inch, but you hold bigger device anyway. It's good enough. And Apple could always go to a higher density. They're careful to spread their pain to developers out. Developers had to go to Retina, then they had to increase to 4 inches. This year they're going to have to cope with iOS 7 and the vast amount of changes that come with this. So it's kind of not fair to lump too much stuff on them. But next year, hopefully they've gone to iOS 6, and they can ask them to do something else. Peter, do you have a sweet spot, for where you'd like to see it go?
What, in terms of resolution or in terms of size?
Or size, yeah, just the iPhone screen in general.
I really don't have a lot of penis envy when I look at, people who are using Galaxy Notes or whatever. I look at the bigger screen and I understand that they like them, but I'm comfortable with the screen where it is now. It's a good form factor. It fits into my pocket very well. It's not obtrusive. It's not so big that I feel like I could break it easily. And it remains a very usable size with one hand. I'm not a size queen when it comes to when it comes to phone screens. The trend is definitely for larger screens, but we've talked about this on the iMore show before, Rene. You've pointed out that despite the protestations of many analysts and tech journalists that Apple is quote unquote missing out by not having a bigger screen, the actual data, don't support that. It's the people who are buying those screens are not in the majority of smartphone customers right now.
No, I believe, especially in North America, that's true. What's turning me around slightly, I know historically, just to back up for a second, bigger displays weren't the result of the market going, oh, there might be a need to differentiate with bigger displays. They said, oh, we're going to try and differentiate with LTE, and because early LTE radios were so abysmal, they had to increase the size of the phone to fit better batteries in, and since they had more space, they put bigger screens in, and they were terrible screens when they first put them in. They've gotten better, sometimes still using terrible technology, AMOLED, for example, but it's been an iterative process. What started turning me around on this was both Ben Thompson and Sasha Sagan talking about outside North America. Apple has this way of attacking a market and then slowly increasing their footprint. They did it with iPods. They did it with iPads. Now they're doing it with the iPhone 5C, which will be the first time Apple does 2 new phones. At Apple's size, it's really hard. Not size. When they make phones at capacity, it's really hard to add new models, so they have to do it sparingly. But by creating a less expensive iPhone, people who aren't nerds like us, people who are looking for their first phone, their first smartphone, for whom price is a more sensitive feature, that starts making them part of Apple's addressable market. And there's going to be some people in North America, sure, who want a bigger phone, but in certain parts of the world, there are people who can only afford or only have one device. They don't have a computer, they won't be able to afford a tablet, and for them, the phone is the only device they have, and they need to do more general purpose computing with it, and then size is a factor. So getting a slightly bigger screen enables them to do far more, and that might be the next addressable market for Apple, because right now people are choosing. Just like the old days, they used to have to choose between AT&T or a non-iPhone. Now they're choosing between iOS and a bigger screen device. And if Apple decides there's enough people who would get iOS at a bigger screen device, maybe they add it in. I don't know. I could see that for an iPhone 6 or at least a 2014 product.
Yeah, I was just thinking the same thing. That's an issue. That's a bridge that we'll have to cross in 2014. It's not something that's going to happen this year.
Mark, John Pachowski today was causing some kerfuffle on Twitter when he didn't want to use the iPhone 5C term. That's been the popular term for the less expensive phone for a while now. And people were saying, "What have you heard, John?" I haven't heard anything about the name. I never heard anything besides less expensive iPhone. I might have heard 5C once or twice. Some people have said, if they're 5C this year, what does Apple call it next year? 6C? I mean, I don't think that Apple really cares about the name anywhere nearly as much as internet commenters do, but do you have any sense of where they're going to go with branding the phones this year?
So, 5C makes sense in terms of what I've heard. Like, the quote I keep hearing is, iPhone 5 wrapped up in plastic. So
Me too.
5C, C for colors, colored plastics. So, it's an iPhone 5 in different colors. 5C is a very viable name for that reality of what the phone actually is. So it makes sense in that regard. Looking into the future, like you said, I really don't think Apple cares. You saw the iPhone 5. It's not the sixth iPhone. It's the sixth iPhone. They call it the iPhone 5. There's clearly no qualms about doing whatever they want in the naming regards. That's an issue they'll tackle in the future. The important part right now is dealing with the technical issues, preparing the hardware, preparing the launch, preparing this and that for next year's phone, the phone after that. The naming is not very important right now. It's not very important. It's not a very important question. What do they call the successor to the 5C? They'll worry about it then. Yeah.
I can imagine Peter's store on the weekends, because there was some reports that they would call it the iPhone Color, the way they had the iPod video. But I could see someone coming into Peter and going, iPhone Color? Do you mean the previous ones were black and white? Yes, they came in black. My TV went to color in 1950. What is Apple doing?
God, yeah, you've nailed our customers to a T. A lot of them are toothless old people. It's interesting. It's funny. It's funny. Mark says the iPhone 5C wrapped in plastic, and all I can think is Pete Martell from Twin Peaks. She's dead, wrapped in plastic. It's an interesting thing because everybody loves to bling out their phone, right? Everybody loves to put on some kind of, not everyone, but a lot of people do. A lot of people love to customize their phones with cases that they think better reflect their personality than maybe the plain phone itself. So I'm going to be interested, actually, because we don't actually sell or service the phone. I'm going to be very interested, though, to see when people actually come in with the phones, what they want to do with them. If they just want to drop a transparent skin so people can show off the color, or whether they're still going to want something that completely covers the back, for protection or whatever, and also lets a little bit of the personality shine through. So I'm going to be really interested to see how the third-party market for cases and so on responds once these things are out in the world.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah.
Sorry, Mark. I heard the same thing as Mark, that it's basically an iPhone 5 with a polycarbonate plastic shell on the back in multiple colors. And what I heard also is that because the iPod keeps dropping, and the iPod Touch was the original gateway drug to iOS and the App Store, but first-time buyers now, and increasingly Apple wants people on the iPhone. Tim Cook and Mark has the story better than anyone. Tim Cook wants to promote the iPhone brand, and people who might have gotten an iPod Touch are now increasingly getting cheap Android or cheap other phones. To have the iPhone 5C as the gateway drug, I think, is important to Apple.
The thing that I don't understand, and I'm going to be very curious to see, is that we keep talking about a cheap phone or an inexpensive phone. What does that mean to Apple? You know, what is going to be the price point for this thing that is going to make it so much more appealing for a more mainstream audience than where the iPhone is set right now? The iPhone is set at a premium price. It's the same price that you would pay for a high-end smartphone on Android or a BlackBerry or a high-end Windows phone. But what does cheap mean to Apple? Because it seems that when we've projected this stuff in the past, a lot of people have consistently missed the mark, thinking in some cases too low, in other cases too high. I remember when the iPad was still a rumor, people had no idea that Apple was going to be able to produce a tablet for $499. That's right, absolutely. You know, that was exactly what people were saying. $800. No, that's way too low. It's going to be $1,000. Apple comes out and surprises, blows everybody's doors off with a $500 tablet, and that's at the price of the market. Now, 3 years later, things have changed quite dramatically, and now you can pick up a cheap Android tablet for a couple $100. $5. Right, exactly. Free if you get a 2-year subscription to a newspaper.
They'll give you $100.
It is seriously. It's like breakfast cereal. You find them in your box of Count Chocula now. It makes it. It's just an interesting question, and I guess we'll find out soon enough. But I want to know what inexpensive means to Apple when it comes to a phone.
Me too.
Yeah.
I think we all do. Yeah.
What I heard, and I don't know if this is true or not, but what I've heard is it's going to be $450. And I got the iPad mini price completely wrong. Mark nailed it. I got it way too cheap. I heard $450, but the only reason that's interesting to me is that is widely considered to be the average subsidy price that Apple gets. We have no idea if Apple's going to sell this on subsidy. Some people have said they'll only sell it in Apple retail so they can make extra margin on it, but Apple retail's footprint is nowhere near big enough to support this product, especially internationally. But if they sell it on subsidy, would they make this a $0 phone? I don't think that's in keeping with Apple's brand. I mean, even if they could theoretically do it, people love free, but they do not respect free. They will not call you in the morning for free. So $50, $100, I think, if they do go the contract carrier route, makes sense. But $450, Peter, I think it's like the iPad mini model, where Apple has no interest in people who want cheap phones any more than they have interest in people who want netbooks, any more than they have interest in people who want $100 tablets. They just want to increase slightly the addressable market for their phones, not cater to everybody in the market.
Well, the thing that people have to remember is that a slight increase in market share for Apple increases a huge amount of additional revenue for them, simply because of the scale involved and the consistent popularity of their devices. So that's what Apple is most interested in. Apple isn't interested in market share at the expense of profit. Otherwise, Apple would be called Amazon.com.
Oh! He went there. All right, so kind of wrapping things up a little bit. Apple has 4 major product lines. They have the Mac, they have the iPad, they have the iPhone, and they have the iPod. Last year at the iPhone event, we had the iPhone and the iPod. This year, it's a smaller event. It's being held in Cupertino, 150, I think, odd seats in Town Hall, not at Yerba Buena or the movie theater, wherever that was previously. I have not heard anything about new iPods, and that could be there isn't any. That could be their business is shrinking so much that there's not a lot of people who care to talk about them. Do you think this is going to be an iPhone-only event, Mark? Could we see iPods? Could we see a spec-bumped Apple or just like a more modernized Apple TV in the same package? We know iPads won't be along for the ride. Could there be Mavericks? Anything else on your list?
I think it's really going to be about the iPhone. I think the invitation says it. You mentioned you didn't hear anything about iPods. I haven't heard anything as well. I don't know what they're going to do for iPods. They could change the colors up at the Touch and the Nano to match the colors of the iPhone 5C, perhaps. Maybe a gold Touch, a gold Nano. I don't know. We'll see, though. But I think it's really going to be all about the iPhone and iOS 7, and I think the Cupertino venues are usually saved for like an astronomically new product like the iPad or multiple lines. Like last year they went San Jose, 800 people could fit in that room. They did 3 Macs and 2 new iPads. So.
Well, you did say on Twitter that you think iTunes Radio might be interesting enough to warrant at least a packaging update for the iPad.
Right, but that's not really a new product though. Yeah. That's just they do that all the time. right? Like the iPhone 4S, the iPhone 5, if they keep the iPhone 5 around, they're going to make the packaging, talk about iOS 7, because right now you look at the packaging, it has an iOS 6 screenshot on the phone. So.
Yeah, so it's just updated. Peter, do you have any thoughts on, will we see Mavericks mentioned? Will we hear anything more about the Mac Pro?
I don't think so. I think that that's probably going to happen in October. I don't see it happening next week.
I wonder if iPods will be demoted to the press release. I mean, they've done Macs in the press release before. I wonder if the iPods get the press release this year.
Well, iPods have been a dwindling part of Apple's revenue for a while now. The trend is clear. The writing is on the wall. Fewer people are buying iPods. More people are buying iPhones. People are seeing that the iPhone is worth the money. They need the phone anyway, and they want the added functionality of being able to make phone calls. The iPod, though, still occupies a very important place in Apple's ecosystem, especially for families that have kids that want something like a phone but don't necessarily need a phone. And others too. A lot of people prefer the touch interface of iOS and the ability to download apps, which is something that you don't get with things like the Nano or the iPod Classic. So I think that there's still a big market for it. It's just not the enormous market that it was 3 years ago, let's say. Regardless of whether they talk about it next week or just do it in a press release or do it in a separate event altogether, whatever. The fact is they're going to be new products, so don't worry about it.
In keeping with that, Gene Munster is not going to get his television set. Sorry, Gene. The iWatch, last I heard, it was in the product pipeline, but not for this year. Mark, you've been covering the iWatch, again, probably better than anybody. That does not sound like it's going to be at this event, nor this year product.
No, I don't think so. Something's interesting, actually, if we have a few seconds.
For sure, go ahead.
I remember there were big rumors in mainstream publications really earlier in the year that Apple was prepping this watch device for the end of 2013. And here we are, September 5th. Samsung comes out with this, seemingly rushed product yesterday. Maybe Apple seeded those fake rumors, something I've been thinking about, to get Samsung to rush their product out the door. Then 2014 hits and Apple blows everyone away. I mean, come on, that sounds very Steve Jobs to me. And Steve Jobs is still, his culture is still in the company.
Well, remember when the iPad rumors were going out, Steve Ballmer couldn't wait to rush up on stage at CES and show off the HP Slate, which had a button you could push to eject a cartridge that told you it was certified for Windows.
I didn't even know that part, the cartridge part, but that says it all, doesn't it?
No, absolutely. And I only heard that it left prototyping earlier this year, and that usually takes a lot longer than that to get to product. So I don't anticipate that for this year.
Yeah.
And it's got to do something besides the stuff that the Galaxy Gear does. God, that thing is boring.
It's probably not going to be a watch any more than the iPhone is a corded thing with two round bubbles at the end. I think watch is just a convenient way of referring to it.
I mean, if you look at the iPhone, it was a new take on the phone, but it looked nothing like phones before it. The software worked nothing like software before it for a mobile phone. The Samsung Watch is a watch that I could wear, Rene wears, Peter wears, but with a digital screen and a chip inside to process things. Think about the iWatch the same way. It's going to be a watch just like the iPhone was a phone, but it's not going to look like a watch. Could be some frosted glass that wraps around your wrist, but that's nothing like the band that a Samsung Watch and every watch before it has.
Absolutely. Yeah. Now, you also were very good at reporting about all the biometrics that could go into a watch. Do you think there's any outside chance that that'll make their way into the iPhone? I know Samsung's played around a bit with biometrics on the phone.
Besides the fingerprint scanner?
Yeah, blood. I don't think there's any need or time for blood pressure or pedometers.
It seems more natural on something that you would wear on your arm or your wrist. So I don't think that would make sense in the iPhone as far as I can picture it into the future.
It's not a lifestyle companion the way the Galaxy S4 is.
Right.
All right, so Apple's event is officially now scheduled. The invitations went out. It will be September 10th, which is next Tuesday. It will be at 10 a.m. Pacific time, which is 1 p.m. Eastern time, and I think that is 5 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time. None of us here got invited, but Peter's partner in crime at The Loop, Jim Dalrymple, will be seated probably next to Tim Cook at the event. I have no way of knowing for sure, but that's my suspicion. But we will all be covering it nonetheless. You're going to do your usually stellar job at 9 to 5 Mac, Mark?
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see. I'll be there. I'll be covering the event. We'll have to see if we'll have a Meta Live blog set up, depending if Apple streams it or not. But yeah, I'm sure I can expect your coverage on iMore as well. Right?
I wonder if there will be streaming. They've been fairly good about streaming recently, but they didn't stream the 2011 event for the iPhone 4S, which was at the same venue, but Steve Jobs was on his deathbed at the time, so they might not have wanted that to be live. You can never depend on whether. I guess we'll see when the Apple TV lights up with that special event channel whether they will or not.
Yeah, it's interesting because I feel that if they were doing streaming for public, they wouldn't really need the satellite events.
Yeah.
But then again, the satellite events could be set up to give journalists or journalists besides us, access to hands-on picking up review units and such in those other countries.
That's my understanding, that they'll go there, they'll get a satellite feed, they'll get a demo area, they'll get product briefings, and that'll happen, I think, in London. There's going to be companion events in Japan and China as well.
Berlin as well.
Yeah, Berlin as well.
And by the way, but before you get off that subject, Rene, I just want to point out, because I've seen this repeated a few times, I think a few people are a little confused about the international dateline. They assume that because there's a September 11th schedule for the China event, that the China event is happening the day after. It's not. It's happening within a few hours of Apple's event. But, China's on the other side of the international dateline. So September 11th in China is September 10th in the United States.
Taiwan and Hong Kong, I think, are 12 hours ahead. I don't remember exactly how far ahead Beijing is, but yeah, it's the next day because it's like Australia is living in the future. They don't have access to any lottery numbers. They don't have iOS 8 already. It's not that kind of future.
That's right.
All right, so Mark, if people want to read more of your writing, and I highly recommend that they do, if they want to follow you on Twitter, where you are also incredibly entertaining, where can they find you?
Yeah, you can find me at 9to5mac.com, and I'm on Twitter at Mark Gurman. That's my name, so easy to find. Where could we find you, Rene?
You can find me at Rene Ritchie, and you can find me at iMore. Peter, what about you?
I'm at iMore. I'm at loopinsight.com. I'm on I'm Flarg, Flargh, on Twitter and app.net, and I'm hiding in the bushes outside your house.
And Mark on 9 to 5 Mac, Peter and Jim on the Loop, and Peter and me on iMore. We're gonna do a quantum mechanics clone of Peter on that day, I assume. Are going to be covering all of this on Tuesday, so make sure you tune in, and we will do our absolute best job to give you the absolute best information on the internet. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, chat room. You were outstanding as always, and thank you again, Mark, for joining us.
Sure, I'm glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Have a good day, guys.